One which I will talk about only very little is proto-discourse. And it's proto-discursive in the sense that it's really only a verbal dance that takes place between individuals. It's the kind of thing that happens when people first meet. And they say, hello, how are you? I'm fine, how are you? And back and forth. And it's really nothing meaningful is being communicated except insofar as you are cooperatively engaging in what is essentially a behavioral exchange, an exchange of speech acts. This is typically characteristic of what happens at the beginning of a deliberation as people are first encountering one another, but is not something that is particularly significant for our purposes. A second is conventional, and I talk about it as conventional because I think it is a very normatively driven kind of conversation. A third I call cooperative, a fourth collaborative. I will elaborate these last three in a minute. I just did want to say briefly theoretically where some of the bases of these come from. In part, it comes from the developmental psychology of George Herbert Mead, an American psychologist, and in response to the reconstructive pragmatics of Jürgen Habermas. Although I find both of these authors quite interesting, but try to critically engage them as well. Okay, conventional discourse. What is this like? And I describe each of these discourses in terms of their orienting aims, what it seems the discourse is trying to accomplish, in terms of the rules of social interaction within the discourse, and rules of conversational relevance, the kinds of things that are appropriate to say and not. And with regard to conventional discourse, it very much orients to the problem. There is a problem that we need to solve by doing something. So the aim of the discourse is to come up with the correct action to solve the problem. That is the practical aim. At the same time, there's very powerfully a social aim of the discourse. And the social aim of the discourse is to maintain existing social relationships. There is already a recognition of the various statuses and differences among the participants in the discourse, and the discourse is conducted in a way that respects how those differences are normally socially constructed, so that people of different status defer to one another in normatively appropriate ways, for example. With regard to, and also in this context, it's very important that those who are allies or friends as they enter a deliberation retain those alliances, and people who are typically opposed will sustain those oppositions in the in the conversational context as well. There are rules of social interaction, and these are specific rules of who can say what when. They're kind of like rules of politeness or civility. And then there are rules of conversational relevance. The notion is that each of the participants is to focus on a topic, typically whatever the problem is. Often, there is no need to respond to the prior speaker. The prior speaker can say something, you can say something completely unrelated to the prior speaker. As long as it's on topic, it's still conversationally relevant and appropriate. I personally find that classroom discussion is mostly like this, as people wait their turn to make their point, which was established relatively early on, and without regard to most of what has been said in the interim period. It's occasionally interesting to reflect on classrooms in this light as well. Contributions tend to essentially add to the list of the dimensions, or not the dimensions, the elements of the problem. So we are talking about a problem of traffic in the city. And so one person talks about narrow streets, another person talks about too many cars, another person talks about the need for a public transportation system, but nobody really addresses, everybody just adds to the assessment of the problem and their various judgments with regard to it. So this is my notion of conventional discourse. In writing, I try to elaborate this more broadly. This is giving it to you relatively quickly. Another kind of discourse, which is what I call cooperative discourse, the orienting aim of the discourse is, first of all, you're still interested in solving a problem, but first of all, you're interested in reaching agreement on the meaning or nature of the problem that you're analyzing. And when various kinds of judgments are being made, implicit values are being introduced, and there is a need to come to agreement as to the nature and relevance of these values. So the conversation is seen as very much oriented to that. With regard to the social relationships that tend to be fostered in such a context, it is somewhat culturally relative here, but in democratic societies, the presumption is that that kinds of social relationships that must be fostered, a goal of the deliberation, are relationship that respects the integrity of individuals and the equality of voices that may be brought to bear. So the orienting aim is quite different than that of conventional discourse. Rules of social interaction, behavioral rules are negotiated. They're not simply assumed as they were and undiscussed as they were in conventional discourse. Now they become a actual object of discussion, and people try to negotiate what those are in light of the aims of the discourse of coming to common understanding and ensuring voice and equality. Rules of conversational relevance, there's a different way of thinking about the conversation that begins to orchestrate it, that there is a recognition that there are many voices and many dimensions of the problem, and if this conversation is going to proceed, it has to be organized in some way. And typically there will be an attempt to have at least a tentative organization established at the outset, and people then orient their comments accordingly. So it becomes a very typical move to say, you're making an interesting point, but it does not bear on the part of the problem that we're discussing now, and can we defer it to later? The contributions, relevant contributions, to elaborate what it is you are talking about, to explain your perspective on the problem, your understanding or meaning becomes critical. Also, there is a notion that listeners also have responsibility for speakers, that they're not only there to listen and agree or disagree, but they are there to help elaborate the idea of the speakers themselves, to help them develop their ideas, is part of the responsibility in a conversationally relevant act. And then finally, the third kind I call collaborative. These names are perhaps not as helpful as they might be, but I can't think of anything better. I'm more than open to suggestion in this regard. The orienting aims of this discourse are quite different. Its explicit goal is transformative. It begins with the presumption that who we are as individuals is, to begin with, somewhat limited. And the nature of our community is probably flawed. And therefore, a critical aspect of the exercise is to engage one another in a way that has transformative impact on each of us and the community of which we are a part. And also in this context is to choose courses of action which not only solve immediate problems, they may not even help with an immediate problem to begin with, but are very much oriented to this broader and more long-term problem of personal and social transformation. The rules of social interaction and relevance now sort of collapse on one another. There is an orientation to what I call complementarity, which is an idea that I'm trying actually now to develop somewhat further. But complementarity begins with a recognition that there are basic emotional, cultural, and cognitive differences that exist among the participants in the conversation, and that these have to be recognized at the outset. And establishing common grounds of understanding and value is not so easy, and is a tension-wrought activity that will produce some convergence and divergences at the same time. So not only do you recognize these differences, but it's not enough to recognize them. You have to challenge the distinctions as well, because part of this has this transformative element to it. So this was the typology that I brought to bear. In some sense, the conventional discourse reflects how ideological conservatives might assume people talk to one another, would hope they talk to one another in this way. The cooperative discourse very much reflects the presumptions and goals of liberal Democrats. A lot of the people who do deliberative democracy work, particularly in the United States, people like Amy Gutmann or Joshua Cohen or some of the theorists who do this. This is the sort of presumptions they make. The collaborative discourse begins to call for a kind of transformative discourse which is a little bit more sympathetic both with agonistic Democrats on the one hand, people like Chantal Mouffe, and people like Jürgen Habermas, hoping that discourse has something of this quality. Then the question is, how do people do this? And I'm going to talk about one study that I've started. We've now expanded it into several others, and I will talk about these rather quickly. But this first study is interesting. I only looked at two groups of citizens who came together for the purpose of deliberating about the quality of education in their community. They are an interesting group because they were almost entirely university educated. Many of them had graduate degrees. It is an upper middle class or upper class community. They are wealthy. And they're particularly interesting to me because in many respects, these are the kind of people one would assume have the requisite training in terms of their education, the requisite sense of empowerment because of their wealth and occupation, and certainly the motivation because they volunteered to meet together for, initially it was to be 6 two-hour meetings, and eventually they demanded additional ones because they didn't get the work done. So they were highly motivated. These are the kinds of people who one would assume would most adequately, naturally deliberate well with one another. So as I mentioned, there are two groups of 12 people. They're small enough so that people can talk and interact. They ended up meeting for 7 two-hour sessions, and they produced a set of recommendations that then went to the superintendent of schools, and they also decided that they wanted to communicate them to the public at large, and so they sent a mailer out to the larger community reflecting their judgments. There was some facilitation. They were a difficult group to facilitate precisely because they felt educated and empowered, so they did not want to listen. But the key to the facilitation was to try to avoid a situation where they immediately jumped to very specific problems. That there is a bad teacher at this school, or we believe there should be more art taught. Rather than jumping immediately to those questions, we asked them to frame the question more broadly to begin with. And so we asked them to step back and say, what kind of person with what kinds of capacities do you want your child to be when he or she is 18 years old? And then having established that, what role can the school play in this? And therefore, what kind of curriculum should we now have? This was our attempt to get them to think more broadly and to open up the possibilities for them to think more critically about the curriculum that was being offered. We then analyzed their conversations. We taped all of them.